Hello and welcome to this presentation on the neurophenomenology of stage development. My friend and colleague Dr. Alison Ohms and I conducted a little QEEG study that looked at the correlates of my stage model and patterns within my brain. Our starting assumption or hypothesis and main intention is the idea already voiced and pointed to by Jean Piaget that mental or cognitive, psychological or conscious development is the outcome or a correlate and aspect of organic changes. So that every stage, every state of consciousness is related to some organic pattern that's in part constituting it, and on the other hand, is influenced by our mental states. Our idea thus is that the states and stages of consciousness unfold along a certain trajectory of organic modifications and modulations and structural patterns within our organism and brain. Ultimately, a good stage theory that's measurable through text or other means should incorporate a high agreement with changes within the organism and most likely changes that we can measure through neuroscience, such as through quantitative EEG, as we attempted to. In order to understand our main hypothesis, it can be helpful to take a look at my model to get a simplified grasp and overview of what it tells and assumes and measures. First of all, it builds up on four transcendentals. Transcendental means underlying structures in consciousness that contribute and sustain and build all other aspects that show up within ourselves. So a transcendental itself is non-existent in a sense, but it constitutes whatever you see, think, or feel and make up through your mind. The first of it is identity. So in the beginning, our mind has a function, an ordering principle that supports you to identify stuff, to classify it, to make up certain objects or identities. Second, if you have an identity, our mind can start to invert these objects or identities. So it can tell you that you don't want something to be as it is, or that something is okay just as it is. And this brings the ability to dream up futures, to get active, to feel free, and to negate whatever is there and doesn't fit your perceptions in order to transcend it towards a better state. Third, if you have objects and their negation, you can start to compare either of them. You can look how they are similar, dissimilar, maybe even fit into the same category, and you can start to interrelate and combine them to a degree. For this, you need reciprocity, which is the third transcendental. Finally, if you have identity inversion, reciprocity, you can get to a synthesis. You can learn to mitigate the differences and mediate in a way between different objects that they come into a structure that's larger than the parts themselves, generate a new structure of the whole, a new unity, a new synthesis. Finally, our model assumes a fifth realm, a so-called non-dual realm, or one of suchness and unity that combines all earlier four functions and likewise gives birth to them. So that firstness, secondness, thirdness, and fourthness, or identity, inversion, reciprocity, and synthesis are grounded within this final realm and the self-expression of it. From these four transcendentals and the fifth realm, we get a spectrum of consciousness that is built up out of 4 times 4 stages and the final realm of 4 stages that's coordinating the interrelationship of all earlier expressions of the transcendentals and holding them and giving birth to them. And in our study, we mainly looked at a part of this overall trajectory, namely from 2.4 to 4.1, as they are easily accessible through meditation and well discernible, and likewise to a degree validated through the correlation and agreement with other models and theories. The hypothesis that we then hold is on the first hand a horizontal one, that there is constantly a circular reorganization of the neuronal working space that unfolds along the four functions from firstness to secondness to thirdness to fourthness. And on the other hand, a vertical trajectory that unfolds these functions as certain stages and layers along the gradient from evolutionary older brain networks and areas to evolutionary younger ones. So first, let's look at the hypothesis of circular reorganization of the working space. And there is already some evidence that shows that our brain moves in a circular fashion from the right to the left hemisphere by disintegrating medial and lateral aspects of the brain in order to complete, for example, learning or creative tasks, and likewise growth processes in infancy and childhood. Our assumption thus simply is that likewise later stages are following the same pattern as learning cycles and growth spurts within early childhood. And this growth then likewise means a continuous and successive integration of the more medial default mode and the more lateral task positive modes of our human mind and existence. When we now want to understand the vertical trajectory, we can look at research that was conducted with infants. And there we see that on the one hand, we have a circular movement from the right to the left hemisphere. And on the other hand, have a gradual growth from evolutionary older brain areas to evolutionary younger ones, starting with the insular cortex already throughout pregnancy and then throughout the first months as a center of neuronal activity. Then the orbital PFC gets added around 6 months. Then the ventral part of the prefrontal cortex comes online with 9 months, and then the dorsal part that is enabling the recognition of patterns builds the culmination of this trajectory. Likewise, when we look at certain sources like the Upanishads or other mystical texts, whether in the West or in the East, we find certain chakras or energy centers, oftentimes related to organs, that unfold throughout our body, and likewise can be found as the correlates of certain brain areas, such as when we look at heart rate variability studies and studies on heart failure, we will see that the ventral prefrontal cortex, especially the medial part, is related to those changes in heart rate, and likewise stages that relate to the mind or the third layer tend to mention the heart as their culmination or center. And that's true for all of these layers. All of them point to certain organic functions, and people living from these stages point at these locations within the body as centers of their attention and consciousness. And so we, on the one hand, have the circular motion from right medial to left medial, and on the other hand, the vertical motion from the insular hub to an orbital hub to a ventral hub to a dorsal hub, and finally into the precorneal hub that then hypothetically coordinates the reorganization of the whole trajectory through certain mechanisms such as acetylcholine control. Then some technical facts on our study. We used a 20-channel EEG system, the classical 1020 system. And as a software, the Neural Navigator. It, in a sense, is a real MRI with a lot of voxels, which basically means that through regression analysis, it attempts to show the same images, such as source location or diffuse and tensor imaging that you know from fMRI studies. We looked at leg coherence, which means basically the structure of the global working space in the brain, how certain areas work together and fire together and align in temporal patterns. And we did this through a rudimentary time series analysis, which meant I was meditating, and every time I changed state or stage, I wrote down the time, and then we cut the recordings into different pieces and compared them to each other visually. On this image, you see my baseline. Baseline means my state when I'm doing nothing but having closed my eyes and slightly focusing on my breath. Since you don't see any color in it, it means that it's like the standard normative mean brain. So it's just an ordinary brain as it seems that doesn't show, in this case within the alpha range, any exceptional activity. On the later images, you will see a rise from yellow to red coloring, which indicates deviations upwards from this baseline. So let's take a look at the first hypothesis, namely the circular reorganization. This circular reorganization now is compared within two different recordings. They happened somewhat with a week in between and were very similar. Just as our hypothesis states, we start with left medial activity within the pattern of forceness, so the culmination of our developmental layer or transcendental seems to relate to the left medial prefrontal cortex. And then when we move into the next first stage, the firstness aspect, activity spreads out into the right hemisphere, again aligning with our hypothesis. In this image, you can see within the midline how the cingulate cortex gets more active and how activity slightly spreads towards the right part of the brain. The increase in the left hemisphere is most likely due to the practice itself. That's an open, attentive awareness that's likewise comparing the meditative state with the targeted state. So I'm permanently surveilling myself and observing and investigating whether I actually fit into the pattern of a certain state, which includes increasing left hemispheric activity and integrates these functions of contextualization and discernment. Likewise, I have a natural tendency to move into the second half of a stage. Therefore, naturally, the hypothesis would indicate that we see more left hemispheric activity and that the right hemispheric patterns show up less thoroughly and clearly, so that in future studies we have to conduct the experiments a bit more with a focus on quarters versus complete stages. Here you see the third phase. You see a slight decrease within the right hemispheric cingulate cortex, while the left hemispheric structure stays strong in both conditions. And you see likewise that the left lateral prefrontal cortex is still quite active, while there is a slight reduction in the right hemisphere. And then within the fourth phase, you see again how neuronal activity moves into the medial prefrontal part of the brain, showing a similar image as we had at the starting point at the 2.4 stage. And finally, when we move into the first stage of the next layer, the activity again starts to spread out into the right hemisphere, indicating the start of a new layer. And you have to consider and understand that these are shifts that happened within 1 hour. So each of these brain states was roughly just 10 minutes, and EEG tends to be very stable over time. So when you see all of these changes within an hour, you can clearly state that something's happening. And if that something repeats at different points in time, in alignment with the hypothesis, you can take for granted to some degree that there is something actual and real happening, both within consciousness and within the organic patterns that might underlie consciousness, or at least the objects and structures that we perceive within it. Then let's get to our next hypothesis, the vertical trajectory. So we didn't look at firstness so far. It needs a lot of effort to actually regress into these infant stages, and we didn't analyze the material so far. But maybe soon we will look at this as well. Here you can see on the one hand that there is orbital activity at the bottom, just as we want to have it. And likewise, later areas are engaged as well, which likely is due to the method itself. So in order to stay within secondness for these 10 minutes the recording lasted, you need the surveillance mechanisms. You need to check whether you fall into the right states and don't trip out of wherever you want to be in and what you want to measure. And so the later areas or the technique itself, which is more or less a forceless experience of witnessing and mentally interpreting it, is likewise active. It gets different when we move into certainness, where it's easier to navigate by itself. You see that the orbital activity drops away and the connectivity patterns stay within the ventral part of the brain, with some exception in the dorsal part that likely relate to the surveillance task or the witnessing aspect. Then when we move into forceness, which overall is defined as a more synthetical and unitive and universal sense of being, you see that the orbital part comes online again. We likewise see the ventral part, but you too see an extension towards the dorsal prefrontal cortex, and especially in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. So the activity pattern somewhat matches our predictions and hypotheses. And we too can see this in another recording at another day at another brainwave frequency. So all earlier frequencies that we looked at were alpha band, and here we see more beta activity, likely because I practiced insight meditation the days before to teach some students. And so the brainwave frequencies were in a higher bandwidth wave frequency. And you can see first, so that the more reddish part, so the higher coherence pattern, is in the lower aspects of the brain, the orbital and the ventral part, and in the upper image, it stays within the dorsal part and reduces itself in the ventral part of the prefrontal cortex in alignment with our hypothesis. And then we recognized a lot of non-dual experiences, so to say, within our recordings, states where I felt complete fusion and oneness and unity with all the earlier layers happening through the technique itself that's very demanding and asking me to stay in a sense of connectedness, not with any of these aspects, but with the overall tapestry within which they arise and as which they self-express. And there you can see that the fifthness aspect, as we hypothesized it, within the precuneus and the parietal lobes gets strong as well, connecting the earlier aspects of the layers together, as it seems, so that in a sense we see all four layers mirrored in some of our recordings, and look at this as some special insight and evidence, preliminary evidence for the accuracy of our hypothesis. Another thing that was very interesting is that we had high alpha-1 coherence throughout most of the recordings. And within this hypercoherence that seemingly spread out from the cerebellum, we could see the patterns of development unfolding embedded into this coherence, so that the overall recordings in a way are similar to non-dual meditations, such as Transcendental Meditation, Dzogchen, but as well in Centering Prayer, you can see it, that there is a high amount of alpha wave and alpha coherence going on that's governing the reorganization of the brain and the mind into states of oneness and unity, more or less seamlessly and automatically. In this case, with some attendance towards the distinct states within the overall trajectory and some control to stay within them for the amount of time dictated to get some results and changes visible, and not only an image of the overall trajectory that unfolds itself to oneness or its own resolution and fruition. So what we found and what is in alignment with the global workspace theory is the presence of alpha waves, and that the changes within the structural patterns were mostly reflected within them. But likewise, we recognized that it's not necessarily only alpha, but dependent on which meditations I practiced the days before I did the recordings. You can see deviations either downwards into the theta band, for example, when I practiced visualization, such as deity yoga, or into more beta-like wave patterns when I practiced insight meditation the days before. So there is some overall agreement between the recordings that the alpha band seems to be the structural pattern that governs the movement through different states and stages and sustains them. There is a little bit of deviation around them. So from our preliminary findings, and if they hold true in the long run, there are certain questions that can be asked, such as, what does this mean for other developmental theories that are not well aligned with transcendental pluralism, either through their tier pattern that's deviating or generally as having low reliability or agreement with our scorings? And on the other hand, what do certain techniques implicate for growth, such as how useful are certain meditation techniques that reduce leg coherence for the development throughout the stage trajectory? What about certain traditions that rather devalue certain aspects of the reorganizing pattern, such as the default mode, as we might see it in Buddhist and see it in Buddhist meditation recordings? And what does it mean for certain worldviews that tend to go against this reorganization pattern, such as I'm Epicurus, the master and his emissary, that contradicts the growth from the right to the left hemisphere that we tend to see in the recordings and in actual research on stage development and learning cycles? Now, our last slide. On the one hand, I'm still working on my PhD project that could need some funding in order to conduct further recordings. On the one hand, because we want to increase the recording time from 10 minutes into maybe half an hour per stage, so that we can more granularly look at water stages and subpatterns and see whether the actual hypothesis shows up even more clearly. And likewise, we want to refine the sequence analysis and add statistical analysis to our visual validation attempt. Finally, in the long run, we would like to build a normative database for stages and then build neurofeedback applications if we find some overall pattern that holds true for a larger sample size than me personally. And we already have some indications because Alison and I conducted research at the New Human University where we applied both stage assessments and EEG. And here you see the growth of a person moving from the fourth quarter within the firstness stage. And you can see the medial activity pattern, the coherence centering around the default mode towards the first quarter of the 3.2 stage. So a secondness aspect where you can see activity spreading into the right lateral part, mitigating or attenuating the medial default mode. Sadly, we only have a small sample size, and the sample size mostly falls into the range between 3.1 and 3.2. So we would need to find people that fall into the later stages to more clearly validate and show that there is something to our hypothesis. And that's what we want to do in the future, within the next year or the next few years, to see whether we can come up with something that actually can support and help people in their growth and in their healthy development and waking up and growing up process to foster a more flourishing humanity, basically. So thank you for making it to this point. Thank you. I'm grateful for this, and maybe you reach out and contact me or Alison, and we can have a conversation. And we're happy to share the data with you and look at it together. Or you might be interested to just be a participant in the study and take a developmental assessment and visit Alison or me to get a recording done and get part of a larger sample to conduct this study.